Good afternoon and welcome to week number 2. This week, it's been really good getting to know everyone in the discussion boards. I'm going to continue to review the discussion board post and comment on your discussion boards, particularly from the getting to know you as I'm making connections to everyone out there. I want to remind you to go back and review the discussion board posts to get a sense of what your peers are talking about in relationship to the learning materials. It's also really beneficial for you to go back and review the topics, the questions discussion board to see what other students are asking about the learning materials, because here you may find that you have a question about the material that was answered and addressed in the question section of the discussion board. This week, you'll only have one discussion board to do for attendance, but it's going to be a little bit more involved than your past discussion board post from week 1, and I'll get into the details about that in just a minute. But before I get into that, I want to talk briefly about what we were doing in week 1 and how we're going forward in week number 2. So in week number 1, you focused on this social historical context of America in transition post Civil War. So you read about a lot of changes that happen in the American landscape. For instance, migration, immigration. We also read about how technology had a major influence and how literary societies within the American context were sort of developed as a result of these new technologies. So this week you're going to focus on how realism and naturalism and regionalism sort of developed into this approach in the American literary context, and how we saw that in terms of modernity. Now, in your book, they're going to describe modernism, and you're going to be reading poetry from modernist poets. Now, in regards to modernism, modernism is a very large term, which some historicists place the beginning of modernism as early as the late 15th century with the age of exploration, all the way up into the 1960s. Now, when we think about modernism in regards to the American literary context, we're looking at this. We're looking at the late 19th century transitioning into the 20th century. So, what you're going to be reading about this week, you're going to be seeing how realism and naturalism really influenced this shift from ghost stories, stories that were emotionally overwrought, really high dramatic language, to more of a focus and attention on the actual subject. So there isn't really this conversation about what's inherently good and what's inherently evil in a larger social context, but more so the writer is focused on how the individual might construct a concept of good and evil based off of their particular social situation. Another thing that's characteristic about American, or when we think about this modernist approach to literature, is also the way in which critics were analyzing literature. So you're going to read about an influential modernist critic by the name of T.S. Eliot this week. And his approach to literature was more of a scientific approach, and the text was separate from the author. So the way in which you read literature this past week was I wanted you to make a biographical connection. I wanted you to look at some of the things that went on in the author's life, and perhaps that information might provide an interpretation to the author's text. Well, for this week, and as you move into paper number 2, you're going to throw that concept out of the window and you're going to focus on the text itself. So, for instance, T.S. Eliot believed that there is a way to textually analyze a piece of literature, removing the actual author from any interpretation. And so, in this situation, you'll focus on literary devices such as plot, theme, setting, character. So when we focus, the idea of or approaching a piece of literature from a new critical perspective is this idea that as long as you are able to understand how the literary devices are working within the text, there are some commonalities, some common themes that you'll see happening or reoccurring in literature. So this is the way, so there's more of a code to reading literature rather than this individual interpretation based off of the author's experience. We have more of a universal approach by implementing literary devices. So for this week, I have given you, there's a link in the discussion board that talks about new criticism. And so, and that, I'm sorry, it's a link to a PowerPoint presentation that I use in my literary analysis classes to talk about new criticism, to give you an understanding of how to approach this literature for this week along with your paper number 2. Now, don't be afraid when you hear that term new criticism or formalism. This is just an interpretive way of looking at the literature, and I want you to become more aware of the different approaches to analyzing literature. So, for instance, in your first paper, you use biographical information to make a personal connection, which sort of establishes why you're going to do this research on this particular author. And you'll find out in paper number 2, or as we move forward to paper number 2, you're going to remove the author from that discussion and focus on his or her fiction and focus on the actual literary devices and as they occur in that fiction to create an interpretive approach from a literary device perspective. Now, I have uploaded, and let me just pull up the page in the content section. I've uploaded a description of week 2 course activities. So for this week, pull this up. So for this week, you'll begin with contextual readings about American culture and society at this time period in your textbook, and then you'll move on to poetry from modern American writers. Make sure that when you read the poets, that you read their biographical information as well to sort of give you a context of the actual piece of literature. And finally, I want you to review the assignment sheet for paper number 2. Now, paper number 2 will be due starting next week, or I'm sorry, starting July 22nd through the 26th. And here it's the same length as your biographical essay, but instead of looking at biographical information, you're going to be looking at literary devices such as character, plot, theme, setting, or tone to develop an interpretation of the text. Now, one of the things I always tell my students that you are the critic. So there's never a right or wrong interpretation. It's only wrong when you're not able to provide contextual examples from the actual literature itself. One of the things that I want you to make sure that you review that's not in your week course 2 activities, and I'll make sure I'll put this on the announcements page, is the sample new critical essay. Now, what I've done is that I have uploaded in the content section a sample student essay written on Theodore Roethke's poem, My Papa's Waltz. So once you read that sample critical essay, you'll get a sense of what I'm looking for in paper number 2. So notice that this student does not focus on the life of Theodore Roethke to make a connection to what's going on in that poem. Rather, the student looks at literary devices such as tone, such as word choice, such as setting to get an understanding or to provide an interpretive analysis of that poem. So I have a couple of things on content section along with the sample analysis from the student that you can focus on to give you a better understanding of new criticism. Now, going back to that discussion board. Now, when you go to the discussion board this week, there'll be a link there that will that will direct you to a PowerPoint presentation, like I said before, that I use in my literary analysis classes. Now, this PowerPoint presentation is brief, but it'll also give you some steps on how to approach the literature from a new critical perspective. Many of you have already done this before in your high school classes, so don't fret. I'm just giving you the definition of that particular approach to literature. Okay? So, as always, I'm here if you have any questions, comments, or concerns. As a reminder, please go back through week number one, the discussion boards in week number one, and review other students' responses. I will be going back, making comments through week one, and go back and make sure that you post for this week for week number two. Again, I'm here if you have any questions or concerns. Happy reading, and I will see you in cyberspace.